December 7th, 1941, 07:55 a.m., over the calm blue of Pearl Harbor, just off the island of Oahu. You are in the cockpit of a Nakajima B-5N Kate, low over the water, the ocean's surface a mirror that throws sunlight into your eyes. The roar of the engines is a living thing in your bones, not one voice, but a chorus of dozens. Kates, Val dive bombers, Zero fighters, every machine a note in a single brutal chord. Salt air stings your nostrils. Fuel, hot oil, and the metallic tang of stress fill the cockpit. Ahead, through a thin haze, the neat rows of American battleships lie at anchor like sleeping beasts. Gray hulls, tall superstructures, the mastwork of battleships and cruisers clustered in Battleship Row. They haven't seen you yet. Below you, water erupts as a torpedo skips past a pontoon and spray sprays the underside of your wing. You feel the plane shudder from sympathetic vibration, metal on metal. Ahead and to starboard, a plane releases its torpedo, and for an instant, time narrows to one sight line. The black cylinder slipping from the aircraft, the small wooden trussel tail wobbling, the tiny control surfaces that will guide its fall into the sea. The torpedo hits the water, noses down, and disappears beneath the glassy surface toward the bulky flank of a battleship. On board the carriers chasing history across the Pacific, the discussion had not been kind. At Kure and Yokosuka the winter before, senior staff and many admirals had laughed when the idea of launching torpedoes into a shallow, airy harbor was raised. Type 91s were good, slender weapons, destroyer and cruiser torpedoes built for long-range surface combat and deep-water conditions. They had never been imagined as harbor killers. The combined fleet convened committees and sobered engineers with folded arms. Pearl is too shallow, one senior staffer had sniffed. Another said they'll bury themselves in the mud or broach and bob uselessly. Even some of the strike planners urged caution. Shallow water, floating debris, shallow keels, all lethal for torpedoes designed to run 40 feet down. But the Admiral's scoffs did not deter a smaller persuasion, a handful of naval engineers and a stubborn core of torpedo men who believed that cunning and carpentry could bend physics. They took Type 91s apart like clockmakers, looking for ways to change how they met the sea. They attached temporary wooden fins to the tail assembly, crude, sacrificial structures that would break away on contact with the hull or soon after being waterborne. They altered the hydrostatic behavior with modified valves and ballast adjustments, so the torpedo would accept a much shallower running depth than its designers originally intended. They tested in calm bays and behind breakwaters, watching the torpedoes run waist-deep and keep stable, sliding along as if they belonged there. The project was not glamorous. It smelled of sawdust and diesel and late-night coffee. Men who were technicians and petty officers stayed up soldering gyros and checking control surfaces. Higher-ups shrugged and accepted the modifications, but without enthusiasm, a grudging permission rather than a mandate. Admirals in ash-gray uniforms still muttered that it was risk, not innovation. They expected failures. The torpedoes became, in the brass man's view, a necessary oddity, useful in theory, useless in practice. Later, that dismissal would be remembered as complacency. Now, months and tests behind them, the modified torpedoes were a string of small miracles packed into metal. They rode straight and true. Their wooden tails held them stable through the drop and snapped free in water, doing their work and departing, leaving only the steel warhead to do the rest. The gyros withstood the slipping turbulence of dive bomb windows and the jitter of low-altitude release. And this morning, as the sun burned off the last breath of dawn, those little compromises and secret carpentry mattered more than doctrine. From the air, you watch the first torpedo strike the side of a Pennsylvania-class hull with a dull, metallic thud. It detonates against armor and fills the world with a new kind of sound, a groaning as rivets and plates fail, an alcoholic hiss of steam and oil. Men on the decks are thrown like dolls, life rafts are layered with smoke, the battleship lists. A second torpedo finds its mark and the list grows until the water finds a seam and rushes to claim it. Below the splintered decks and burning topsides are men who will not stand again that morning. A magazine explodes aboard one ship with a furnace as appetite and kills hundreds in a single ruthless flash. Another tips and rolls, yawing as if in disbelief. Observers from the carriers, watching through binoculars miles away, hear the reports from pilots whose voices ought to have been triumphal, but instead are flat with shock. Even the engineers who'd bent the Type 91 to their will find themselves silent when the first huge anchored ships begin to keel over. The workbench jokes, the Admirals' derisive smiles, the months of marginalization, all of it dissolves in the salt-flavored smoke. High above, a flight leader who had practiced the torpedo drop 100 times feels the cold slide of fear and satisfaction. He has watched a weapon mocked by uniforms and tested in secret prove itself on the greatest stage. Down below, the sleeping pride of a fleet is waking into a nightmare. For a moment, the air itself seems to hold its breath at the scale of what has been done. Not just an attack, but an idea overturned. A small, clever instrument made to answer a large problem.
The birth of the impossible torpedo, Japan's secret workshop. Months before the December sky over Oahu turned black with smoke, Japan's naval engineers were waging a quieter battle, not against an enemy nation, but against physics itself. Spring 1941, Kure Naval Arsenal. The air was thick with humidity and the metallic ring of hammers striking steel. Beneath the surface calm of Japan's naval buildup, a handful of young officers and engineers were fighting a war of ideas. They were under orders from the Naval Air Staff to develop a shallow-water torpedo that could function in harbors no deeper than 40 feet, an absurd requirement for the time. The standard Type 91 aerial torpedo plunged like a stone, requiring open sea to arm and stabilize before it could even think about hitting a ship. Dropped in shallow bays, it would dive too deep, hit the bottom, and explode prematurely, or worse, fail to detonate at all. The challenge wasn't just depth, it was precision. The Type 91 was designed to be dropped from about 100 meters high and at roughly 150 knots. Too high, and the torpedo smashed itself to pieces on impact. Too low, and it skipped like a stone, tumbling wildly. But at Pearl Harbor, the pilots would have to fly barely 50 feet above the water, hugging the surface while under fire, to give the weapon even a chance. Engineers at Kure began to modify the torpedo's nose and tail. Their solution was ingenious in its simplicity. Attach wooden fins, shaped almost like wings, to steady the weapon as it fell. The wood acted as a temporary aerodynamic brace, ensuring the torpedo entered the water at just the right angle and speed. On impact, those fins snapped off harmlessly. It was carpentry meeting engineering, a marriage of craft and cunning that even Japan's senior admirals thought ridiculous. In the design office, Lieutenant Commander Shogi Mitsuo, one of the lead ordnance engineers, scrawled notes in charcoal on the wallboard. "If it doesn't swim, make it glide first." His peers laughed, but his superiors didn't. Failure meant disgrace. Japan's war planners were banking everything on the success of a single massive blow that would cripple America before it could retaliate. By May, tests began. At first, they were embarrassing. The torpedoes belly flopped into the water, broke their tails, or dove nose first into the seabed. Engineers measured splintered wood and twisted fins. Commanders shook their heads. "A foolish toy," one remarked during an early demonstration. The ridicule spread quickly through the ranks. Shallow torpedoes became a punchline whispered over sake cups and cigarette smoke. But Lieutenant Mitsuo and his team refused to surrender. They tweaked the ballast chambers, added new air valves, and adjusted the angle of the gyro control to limit the dive arc. Slowly, something extraordinary happened. The torpedoes began to glide, cleanly, predictably. Their descent was graceful, their path stable. One after another, the prototypes hit their mock targets dead center, running no deeper than 10 meters. When one weapon slammed into the side of a test hulk and detonated with a booming shockwave that rolled across the bay, the laughter stopped. The test officers looked at one another in stunned silence. They hadn't just built a torpedo, they had rewritten what an aerial torpedo could be. That summer,
secrecy cloaked their success. The Imperial Navy classified the shallow water Type 91 Mod 2 as Tokushu, or special use, and ordered every modification locked away. Even many pilots of the 1st Air Fleet, the strike group preparing for the Pearl Harbor mission, were unaware of just how revolutionary their new weapons were. They simply received crates marked with coded symbols and orders to drop at 50 feet, 200 knots, 700 meters from target. No one outside the test grounds knew that the future of the entire Pacific War now depended on these strange wooden fin tubes. Back in Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto reviewed the reports from Kure with his usual cold calm. He had been the architect of the Pearl Harbor plan, the man who bet Japan's future on one stunning attack. When he read that the new torpedoes could run in shallow harbors without sinking, he reportedly smiled faintly and said only one thing: "Then it can be done." In that moment, the impossible became operational. The plan was no longer fantasy. Japan could strike where no admiral in history had believed possible, inside a protected harbor, against anchored battleships, using aircraft and torpedoes that defied convention. The mockery was forgotten, the laughter silenced. The Type 91, once dismissed as a weak, useless toy, was about to become the spear point of the most audacious attack the modern world had ever seen.
The calm before the storm. Flight to Oahu. December 7th, 1941. 5:30 a.m. North Pacific, 230 miles north of Oahu. The aircraft carrier Akagi sliced through black water like a silent predator. On her deck, torpedo bombers were being armed, fueled, and checked for the final time. The air stung with the smell of aviation fuel and cold salt spray. Beneath the deck lights, mechanics worked wordlessly, tightening bolts and inspecting propellers as officers barked the same order over and over: no mistakes. Below them, inside the hangar, dozens of Type 91 torpedoes glimmed in the dim light, each one fitted with its fragile wooden fins. Men in oil-stained uniforms ran their hands over the weapon's polished casings as if touching something sacred. Few of them truly believed these torpedoes would work in shallow water, but the operation demanded faith as much as skill. The targets were America's pride, the battleships of the U.S. Pacific Fleet resting at anchor in Pearl Harbor's 40-foot deep bay. A pilot named Lieutenant Torajiro Sano of the aircraft carrier Kaga's torpedo squadron watched as his weapon was mounted beneath his Nakajima B-5N Kate bomber. "It's strange," he muttered to his rear gunner, "a toy made of wood and iron to sink a giant." The gunner smirked. "Then let's see if the toy floats." In the carrier's bridge, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the strike commander, received the final signal from Yamamoto's headquarters in Tokyo. "Climb Mount Nitaka, 1208. It was the coded go-ahead for war. At 6 a.m., the carrier decks roared to life. Engines thundered. Waves of exhaust rolled across the freezing air. Flight leaders stood in their cockpits, raising red flags, a signal to the deck crews. The first plane, piloted by Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, took off into the gray horizon, its wings heavy with bombs. One by one, 183 aircraft launched from 6 carriers, the largest carrier strike force the world had ever seen. Fuchida's radio crackled as he climbed to 10,000 feet. His formation leveled out above a sea of clouds, the rising sun glinting off the wings of the planes. Below them, the torpedo bombers hugged the waves, their propellers just meters above the ocean. The airmen flew in silence, the drone of engines the only sound.
As they neared Oahu, the clouds thinned. Suddenly, the island appeared, green hills, a lazy coastline, and far ahead, the gleaming outline of Pearl Harbor. Through the thin morning haze, the American battleships lay perfectly still. Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California. To the Japanese pilots, it looked like a photograph, frozen in time. From his lead plane, Fuchida could see everything. "They are all there," he said quietly to his navigator. "Every one of them." He reached for his radio transmitter and sent the coded phrase that would ignite the Pacific War. "Tora, Tora, Tora," meaning complete surprise achieved. At sea level, Lieutenant Sano's torpedo squadron dropped to attack altitude, just 50 feet above the water. The waves whipped against the plane's belly as he gritted his teeth, focusing on the black shapes of American battleships ahead. Alarms began wailing from the harbor as anti-aircraft crews scrambled. Smoke plumes began rising. The first bombs had hit the airfields. "Prepare to drop," Sano shouted. His bombardier armed the release lever. The plane shook as machine gun fire streaked past, tracers cutting through the sky. Sano leveled out, lined up his sights on the USS Oklahoma, and pressed the trigger. The torpedo dropped, cleanly, smoothly. It struck the water, its wooden fins breaking away just as designed. For a moment, he thought it would tumble. Then it glided forward, straight and true. From the cockpit, he saw it hit. A column of water and flame erupted beside the ship's hull. "Direct hit," his gunner yelled. Moments later, more torpedoes slammed into West Virginia and California. The shallow harbor, once considered torpedo-proof, was turning into a cauldron of fire and steel. In the air, disbelief rippled through the Japanese pilots. The torpedoes were working. Every one of them. The impossible had become reality. Back on Akagi, technicians listening to the radio reports stared at each other in stunned silence. The weapons they had once called useless were now sinking the mightiest fleet afloat. One engineer whispered, almost reverently, "We made them fly."
The day the giants fell, the torpedo that changed history. Pearl Harbor, 8 a.m. The calm waters of Oahu had become an inferno. The once pristine bay was now a battlefield of roaring flames and twisted metal. American sailors stumbled from their bunks, choking on smoke, half blinded by fire. The sound of torpedo detonations echoed through the harbor like rolling thunder. From the deck of the USS West Virginia, Petty Officer Frank Lomax felt the deck lift beneath his feet as another explosion ripped through the hull. He threw himself flat, gripping the steel as a wall of boiling water and oil rose over the side. His ship was dying, the first of many. Across the harbor, the Oklahoma took hit after hit. 5 torpedoes tore through her port side in under 10 minutes. The great ship listed violently, capsized, and trapped hundreds of men below deck. The California was next, struck twice and left flooding at her moorings. The Nevada, trying to escape the harbor, became a moving target, chased by torpedoes and bombs until she ran aground, smoke billowing from her decks. What shocked both sides was the weapon itself. American officers had always believed Pearl Harbor too shallow for aerial torpedoes. It was doctrine, an unbreakable rule of naval warfare. Yet now, Japanese torpedoes were gliding just beneath the surface like deadly sharks, traveling hundreds of meters before slamming into battleships with devastating precision. At 8:06 a.m., one of those torpedoes struck the USS Arizona beneath her forward magazines. The explosion that followed shattered the harbor. A fireball so fierce it vaporized steel and men alike. The explosion could be seen from miles away. The entire ship split apart and sank within minutes. More than 1,000 sailors were lost in an instant. Lieutenant Torajiro Sano, circling above, watched the inferno with disbelief. His shallow-water torpedo, the same weapon laughed at months earlier, had become the instrument of one of history's most catastrophic naval defeats. They called it impossible. "And yet it swims like a fish," he muttered, his voice trembling. Below him, chaos consumed the harbor. Men dove into the burning water, swimming through oil slicks that ignited as torpedoes struck. Explosions rolled one after another. Battleships that had taken decades to build were reduced to twisted skeletons in under 2 hours. By 8:45 a.m., the first wave was over. The second came minutes later, hammering airfields, hangars, and shipyards. The air smelled of cordite and diesel. The sea burned orange from reflection from the fires. Out at sea, aboard the carrier Akagi, Admiral Naguno's bridge was eerily calm. Radio operators relayed messages from the returning pilots, success codes, confirmed hits, mission complete. When the reports of Arizona, Oklahoma, and West Virginia sinking came through, a low murmur spread across the room. Officers stared at each other, stunned. Even Commander Genda, one of the mission planners, whispered in disbelief. "Our torpedoes, they actually worked." It wasn't arrogance anymore, it was awe. The shallow-water torpedo, the weapon mocked as useless, had shattered the very foundation of America's Pacific power. Hours later, as the strike force turned north toward home, Fuchida looked down at the smoking ruins of Pearl Harbor. His logbook recorded one simple observation: enemy battleships, all heavily damaged or sunk. Airfields destroyed. Mission complete. But in that silence, none of them realized the deeper truth, that their moment of triumph was also the moment they sealed Japan's fate. The shock and success of that morning would awaken a sleeping giant. The laughter that had mocked the Type 91's wooden fins would be replaced by the thunder of an industrial storm beyond imagination. Still, on that December morning, amid the drifting smoke and floating wreckage, the engineers who had once been ridiculed could only marvel. Against every law of physics and probability, their tiny torpedoes had done the impossible. They had sunk an empire's pride and rewritten the rules of modern warfare.